Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to Holy Trinity Minchinhampton on this chilly evening, and a special welcome if this is the first time that you visited us here. Please come back another time to see our beautiful windows in the daylight. Booklets about the windows and sponsorship forms are available at the back. Copies of Chis Harwood's wonderful book on our church are also available for £20 at the back. And if you would like a tour in the future of the windows, please just speak to me afterwards. My name is Judith Cleaver, and I'm a member of the Windows team, together with our leader David Thackeray, who will speak to you later, Mandy Judson and Tony Lambert. Can I just say, if a fire breaks out, you will be ushered from the building. And if you have a mobile phone, kindly put it on silent or turn it off. Very shortly, Chloe will speak to us and then answer questions afterwards. And at 8:30, refreshments will be served in the porch room. Donations towards them and also our windows will be gratefully received, and there is a fixed charge for a glass of wine. Please do join us, as it's a chance for further questions and any comments you'd like to make. Dr. Chloe Reddaway is no stranger to us here, as she is a member of our congregation. What you may not know, and what I didn't know till earlier this week, is her official title. MacDonald Agape Research Fellow in Theology and the Visual Arts, and Deputy Director of Arts and the Sacred at King's College London. Chloe, we are thrilled that you have agreed to talk to us this evening, and we wait impatiently to hear what you have to share with us on windows of the temple and jewels of the New Jerusalem. I hand you to Chloe.
See if the magic works. Definitely. Oh, now it's going too fast. Right. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much to Judith Cleaver and David Thackeray and the Windows team for inviting me this evening, and to everyone who's made this evening possible. We are immensely fortunate to have some very good stained glass at Holy Trinity. What I'm going to talk about this evening is not so much these particular windows, which you can't see in the dark anyway, and about which other people know far more than I do, but about church windows full stop. If I asked you to imagine a Christmas card with a picture of a church on it, it might look something like this, if the screen will cooperate, yes. Because nothing says Christmas like Christmas trees and choristers, and I imagine that your imagined church would also have stained glass windows, because in the cultural imagination in Britain, nothing says church like stained glass windows. Of course, not all churches have coloured glass, even at Christmas, but we think of stained glass very much in ecclesiastical terms. Jewel-coloured light falling through glass is a significant contributor to the sense of sacred place that many people feel in churches. It quite literally colours the experience of congregations and visitors. If that image of a church with glowing windows is embedded in popular perceptions of what a church looks like, it is partly because the Victorians built and restored a lot of churches, and their enthusiasm for stained glass was boundless. But the Victorians were only the latest stage in a long history of church windows. They had 12 centuries of English stained glass to back them up. And why was that? What are all these windows for? Why do we have them here? Well, they're beautiful and they're interesting and they tell some wonderful stories. and they're part of the history of this church, but they're also part of a history that is much bigger than the story of Christians in this village or even of architecture and art in this country. They have a theology of their own, a rationale which takes us far back before churches existed, and which points us way forward to a time when there won't be churches anymore, because we won't need them. There's been a church on this site since at least Norman times, but that's only the recent history of this church. Like all churches, our church belongs within a much deeper history of places of worship, and within a Christian theology of sacred space, which puts every individual church in direct continuity with the tabernacle of the Ark of the Covenant and the Temple of Solomon in the Old Testament, and with the heavenly city described in the visions of the book of Revelation in the New Testament. And in that city, of course, there is no temple, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. Churches are all, in some sense, the Ark, the Temple, and the New Jerusalem. From catacombs to cathedrals, they are all ultimately the same place, the house of God, the place of divine presence, this church included. But why do we need stained glass windows? The temple windows weren't glazed. The catacombs didn't have windows at all. And stained glass is expensive and inconvenient. It blocks out half the light, it gets dirty, it gets broken, it has to be looked after. Our Windows project team knows all about it. So what's so special about it? Well, Christian art in general serves a number of purposes. It is didactic, inspirational, commemorative, and decorative. It may also be revelatory, and for some artworks, for some Christians, it may be sacramental. But if we want to know what is theologically distinctive about stained glass windows, we might have to start with what is physically distinctive about them. To state the obvious, they're windows. They're designed to let in light and keep out the weather, and very few materials can do that. The glass with which they're filled has particular properties, and because of those properties, stained glass windows work with light and colour in a unique way. And each of those things, windows, glass, light, and colour, brings a series of connected and I think stunningly beautiful associations and metaphors and analogies. Stained glass windows as a medium and a context are a very rewarding way in which to think about a lot of things that are really crucial to Christian life. So first, windows. Can we speak of a theology of holes in walls? Well, yes, we can. Biblical references to windows include descriptions of the Temple of Solomon, which had not only gates, porches, courts, and pillars, but windows. Not, of course, with glass, but windows nevertheless. And here we enter the company of some very eminent theologians, some of whom are with us this evening. From the west window, we are observed by St. Jerome and St. Gregory the Great. And from the window nearest the organ, on the north aisle, by St. Bede. Jerome and Gregory are doctors of the Church, and Bede is a great English theologian, but they are all also involved in the theology of church windows. These are not great photos, sorry, I'll go back. These are not great photos, but you can see them in the daylight. And in general, I should say that taking photographs of stained glass is incredibly difficult, and getting high-resolution photographs that one can use for free is also quite difficult. So if some of these slides are not as perfect as we might like, I apologize. Particularly here, come and look at them in the light. Jerome, as you will remember, translated the Bible into Latin in the 4th century, creating the version known as the Vulgate. And according to the Vulgate, the windows of the temple were fenestrae obliquae, oblique, splayed, slanting windows. In other words, The opening in the wall was bigger on the inside than on the outside. And in the 6th century, Gregory the Great, who of course knew that all churches are essentially the tabernacle and the temple, said that the oblique shape of these windows symbolizes divine light entering the mind and illuminating it with spiritual truth, like light entering a building. Gregory says that this light is limited to narrow glimpses like the outside of the window, narrow glimpses of the greater truth, but its effect is an internal enlargement or expansion like the inside of the window, an expansion of understanding and love and zeal. Gregory writes that when the light has begun to break into the mind's understanding, the ray of truth comes, as it were, through a slanting window. And Gregory's exegesis starts a long chain of theological commentary in which church windows are understood to have spiritual significance. One of the people who read Gregory was the English theologian Bede. Like Gregory, Bede knew that the Ark of the Tabernacle and the Temple in Jerusalem signify one and the same Church of Christ. And for Bede, that church is built with the living stones of the elect. The people are the church. Sitting in his monastery at Jarrow, perhaps under an Anglo-Saxon splayed window, Bede describes the people in the church, the people of the church, those living stones, who are illuminated by these windows, as the windows. So the windows of the church are the windows of the temple, and the people of this church are the living windows. And some of these people who are windows are holy teachers who extend their illumination to a wider group of people, who open their hearts with love and understanding. And this chain of ideas carries on. In the 12th century, Richard of St. Victor talked about the windows of the heart through which we are illuminated by divine knowledge, about clear glass as purity and coloured glass as the virtues received by grace, about viewers painting the images of the saints and their virtues as seen in the windows on their hearts. His near contemporary, the Italian theologian Sicard of Cremona, spoke of windows letting in light, but keeping out not only weather, but heresy. The apostles are the windows, and the glass is the minds of the teachers. The windows are also like the senses of the body, which when used properly are the doors of life. So Sicard says that those who desire virtue and life must open their senses like windows to God. And those windows of the human heart, the soul, must be narrow externally to avoid the entry of vanity, but internally they must be expansive to receive spiritual gifts. Another French theologian of the 12th century, Hugh of Fouillois, also understood the windows in terms of spiritual gifts. Building on the work of his predecessors, he says that the oblique windows are the doctors of the church who teach the faithful with their preaching and fill the temple with the brightness of sunlight, and their slanting shape widens the bosom of those who are instructed, expanding their compassion for their neighbours and extending their contemplation of God. All clergy, I think, take note. So our doctors of the church up there in the west window are the oblique windows of the temple, extending our Christian charity. But, says Hugh, there are not only the oblique windows, there are 7 other windows representing the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So through the window of fear of the Lord, for instance, one may receive the light which comes from confession, while through the window of wisdom comes the light of edification, and so on. The gifts of the Spirit could actually be depicted in glass, as in the rose window in the north transept at Sheffield. And of course, we have a rose window with the gifts of the Spirit in the Lady Chapel here. In the 14th century tracery, there is Victorian glass by Hardman and Company showing the dove of the Holy Spirit in the centre and the gifts of the Spirit personified as figures in the wheel around the dove, labelled with their Latin names. At the bottom, 7 streams of light shine down onto the chapel. In fact, they shine down towards the panel of the Annunciation to the Virgin just below, with another representation of the dove of the Holy Spirit there. And I'll say more about Annunciations and glass in just a moment. The 13th century William Durandus said very similar things, and I want to quote from him because he puts it very clearly. He says, "The glass windows of the church are the divine scriptures that repel the wind and rain. That is, they prevent harmful things from entering. And when they transmit the brightness of the true sun, that is God, into the church, that is the hearts of the faithful, they illumine those dwelling there. The windows are larger on the inside of the church because the mystical sense is broader and surpasses the literal sense. The 5 corporeal senses are also signified by the windows, which must be well structured on the outside, lest they allow in the vanities of the world, and they are open within to acquire more freely the spiritual gifts." I think that's another note to our windows team. They must be well structured on the outside. This way of thinking, of seeing symbolic spiritual meaning in physical things, is a very patristic and medieval way of looking at the world. It's not something that people are so well versed in today. But there's an incredible richness to this way of seeing everything through the lens of salvation history and God's purposes for the world. Holes in walls that keep out some things and let some things in turn out to be very theologically important. And if windows as openings between the inside and the outside are theologically potent, so too is the glass that increasingly filled them. Biblical references to glass are, unsurprisingly, very rare. And when glass does appear, it's really the context which is interesting. Job describes wisdom as even more valuable than precious stones, metals, and glass, which means that they were very valuable. All the other biblical references to glass relate to the heavenly city in Revelation, as part of that vision of a New Jerusalem where the city is actually built of jewels and paved with gold. And here the references are to water being like glass or crystal, and to gold seeming to be as clear or as transparent as glass. It's not physical glass, but the likeness to glass that is evoked, and glass and crystal seem to be quite interchangeable. So, insofar as the Bible mentions glass at all, it is as something whose clarity is appropriate to the heavenly Jerusalem and in the context of abundant precious metals and jewels: jasper, sapphire, emerald, onyx, carnelian, amethyst, pearl, and gold that looks like glass. Glass belongs with these very valuable things, which are appreciated for their colour, radiance, transparency, and luminosity. But of course, the biblical use of jewels in a sacred context long predates the vision of the New Jerusalem. Back in Exodus, when God gave instructions for creating the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark was to be constructed out of gold, while the high priest's garments were to be adorned with jewels. So places of divine presence are described in the Bible as bejeweled places of colour, translucence, radiance, and reflectivity. Both the adornment of the Ark and the vision of the New Jerusalem were inspirational for the building and decoration of churches, and jewels and brightly coloured jewel-like glass played an important part in evoking them. And we might think about that when we look at the lavish clothing and setting in our Annunciation window here. This too is a place of divine presence. So glass is a literal reminder of a foundational place of divine presence and worship, and an aspirational reminder of the eschatological place of worship in the heavenly city. Glass reminds us of the places of worship from which we come and the place to which we hope to eventually end up. It also works as a fertile source of symbolism. The physical properties of glass become metaphors for spiritual matters. And here are some examples. Coloured glass is made by subjecting sand and pigment to immense heat. These basic materials are transformed into a transparent and luminous substance, and when light shines through stained glass, it takes on the colours it passes through. So stained glass windows serve as a metaphor for the incarnation of Christ, for the spiritual entering and transforming the base material. Closely associated with this incarnational metaphor is an association between glass and the Virgin Mary. That is not what we wanted. That is not the Virgin Mary. Can we go one more? Yes, no, stop there, perfect. Back one, perfect. Thank you. In a 6th century sermon, Mary is described as the window of heaven, through whom God shed true light, and Christ as the light in her womb. Mary's window-like transparency to the light of God was closely associated to her exceptional purity and her virginity, which could also be imagined in terms of glass. So we find the 12th century theologian Alain de Lille writing this: "Just as the splendour proceeding from the sun enters a glass window, illuminates it, and does not in any way break or violate it, so the splendour of the heavenly Son entered the womb of the Virgin and illuminated it by the grace of the Holy Spirit, and did not in any way break or violate the seal of virginity." Glass was a metaphor for purity, integrity, and the cleanliness assumed of transparency, which is another reason why our windows here need cleaning, because their transparency is a bit dubious at the moment. And as is so often the case, as with Christ's birth, so with Christ's death. If Christ could be conceived and born of a virgin, so could he rise from his tomb without moving the stone, as in Matthew's Gospel. A 13th century English hymn reads, "For he was born of your body and passed through the intact coffin as light passes through glass." This motif of the sunbeam passing through glass became ubiquitous, and we see it not only in texts, but in paintings of the Annunciation and the Nativity. And since Mary is also thought of as the church, Maria Ecclesia, rays of light entering a church through its stained glass windows were a perfect illustration of this. As the house of the Lord, Mary is illuminated internally, like a building, by the divine light which enters her in the virginal conception, like light coming through a window, and the presence of Christ in her womb, a light shining in the darkness. And there's a lovely example in Jan van Eyck's painting of the Madonna in the church. which we will see in a moment. That's the one. This is a very fine modern stained glass window. Completely abstract, totally opaque. Yes, thank you. So you can see the light streaming in from the left there and here in the Annunciation. One could say that every glass window in a church is thus an illustration of and a statement of allegiance to the Incarnation and the Resurrection, a kind of vitreous creed, if you like. And there are commentaries on the resurrection which talk about Christ's resurrected body as being like glassy crystal. Gregory the Great, who, like most people at that time, thought that crystal was a kind of permanently hardened or congealed liquid, says that Christ's human nature was mortal and changeable, but that it became eternal and incorruptible at the resurrection, like crystal. The same connection between crystal and immortality was made in the 12th century by Richard of St. Victor, who likened Christ to crystal because he rose from the dead shining with the glory of immortality. The hardness of crystal and the way it responds to light suggested the resurrection. But crystal wasn't the only jewel associated with Christ. Red jewels were also popular symbols for Christ: the bloodstone, the ruby, the carbuncle. And when pondering the nature of resurrected bodies and how they might appear in heaven, Augustine says that they will be beautiful and radiant and colourful. He writes, "And as for the pleasant colour, how conspicuous shall it be when the just shall shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father." So jewel-like glass and glassy jewels were a way of thinking about the Incarnation. They were a way of thinking about Christ's human and divine natures, his resurrection, and about heaven itself. What is important is not only the glass, but the association of glass with light and colour, with transformation and illumination, and with the biblical precedents around precious, shiny things. Glass has for centuries been accepted as a substitute for jewels, often used on objects like chalices, crucifixes, and book covers, often alongside real jewels. And these things were felt to be closer to God, closer to heaven, through that association with the celestial materials described in Scripture. In all this colour and brightness, there is a constant reference to light. Glass, with all its potential for thinking metaphorically about divine light and illumination, is also literally dependent on external light. Light is the vital force in stained glass. People talk about stained glass as painting with light. Light animates the glass and in turn the building. And light is, of course, fundamental in Christian scripture and symbolism. It is both originary and eschatological. It's not talking to me. There. Oh. Well, we got a glimpse of the sun and the moon, just for a second. Okay. I'll go on talking about the sun and the moon, and we will trust that Howard will get them back for us. In the beginning, of course, God creates light and then sets the sun, the moon, and the stars in the firmament. At the end of the Bible, in that bejeweled city of the New Jerusalem to which we keep referring, there is no night. The sun and the moon are as superfluous as the temple. God is the light, the Lamb is the lamp. As John's Gospel says, Christ is the light of the world. And in Christian art and architecture, as in Christian thought more generally, there is a fundamental assumption of a connection at a symbolic or an essential level between light and God. The Christian tradition consistently positions light as a mediator, moving between divine transcendence and human immanence, between spirit and matter, setting up a relationship that assumes that light becomes knowledge and understanding. And it's not only the rays of light themselves, or the metaphorical association with these rays, that seems to matter when we consider stained glass. Qualities of transparency, translucency, clarity, luminosity, and radiance are central to the value of the glass and to the substitution of glass for other precious materials. And perhaps most important, oh, yes? Ah, wonderful. That was our sun and our moon, and that was our communication with light. And perhaps most importantly, it is this quality of refulgence, which isn't a word we use very often anymore, but light passing through glass also lights up glass. It creates a radiance, a splendid, dazzling brightness. And this refulgence, this glow, cannot be produced on an opaque support. We're not talking about a surface sheen. This requires transparency. The light has to be coming right through the glass. And it isn't just that light illuminates the glass, it's that we also notice the light itself differently. It becomes more visible. Medieval theologians would have called this the diaphanous, the environment in which that image becomes refulgent, in which it glows. One of the greatest proponents of stained glass, the 13th century Abbot Suger, who commissioned new glass for the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis just outside Paris, wrote of how light and colour in his house of God transported him to a heavenly realm. It's this refulgence and radiance that glass shares with jewels that allow us to interpret the coloured glass as heavenly. So what does all this mean for stained glass windows here in the English church? How did all these medieval ideas about windows, glass, light and colour, as symbols of the Ark, the Temple and the New Jerusalem, become the windows that we know in churches across the country? By the 6th century, pale green window glass could be found in important continental churches, and stained glass first reached England in the 7th century. The earliest recorded glass in Britain, stained glass in Britain, was at the Saxon Minster in York in 670. And shortly afterwards, Bishop Benedict Biscop brought glaziers from Gaul to Northumberland to glaze the monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow, using small geometrical panes. Although none of these remain intact, it's quite likely that there were figural windows at Jarrow. This is a controversial reconstruction, but it gives some idea. And if we jump forward to the 12th century, figural subjects had become standard and the colours available were more varied and more intense. But very little stained glass remains from English churches prior to the late 12th century. And this is a rare example from St. Michael from All Saints Dalbury. As Gothic architecture took over from the Romanesque and the earlier Saxon, windows became larger, the scope for glass increased, and it grew in scale and complexity and refinement. So these are 13th century windows from York, and these are 14th century ones from Wells. And then under Henry VIII, the fortunes of glass began to change. Initially, the reasons were not really to do with glass, they were to do with politics and the state of Henry's finances. But the first losses in glass occurred during the dissolution of the monasteries, when glass was either taken to private homes or sold to be melted down. Those monastic churches which were reassigned as secular cathedrals, so not attached to a religious order, or as parish churches, suffered less than most. Malvern and Gloucester, for instance, kept their glass. This was not, after all, primarily a theological problem with glass, or even really with images more generally at this point, although accusations of idolatry are always a useful card in the religious and political arsenal. But Henry wasn't an iconoclast in a principled sense. The Edwardian injunctions of 1547 were much harder on glass. Now there was an idealistic programme of removing images because they were thought to have been abused, venerated, or treated as miraculous in some way. Edward wasn't attacking the glassiness of images in glass, he was just attacking them as images. So where previously glass had been celebrated as theologically unique, now it was lumped in with other image-bearing surfaces. And in fact, glass suffered less than other things, partly because it was less likely to be an object of veneration, and partly for practical reasons. In fact, even the most hardline iconoclasts sometimes overlooked glass. Removing glass is dangerous, it's messy, and afterwards you've got a problem because either your church is full of weather or you have to pay for new clear glass. So quite often practicality won, and the glass stayed, sometimes with the faces removed, sometimes whitewashed, sometimes hidden until it could be reinstalled. A lot of glass was damaged, and this was the first sustained attack on images in glass, but many figural stained glass windows actually survived the Reformation. Things improved for glass under Elizabeth. She had stained glass in her own chapel, and although her injunctions still said that abused images should be removed, she added that churches must be kept in good repair, including their glazing. There wasn't much new glass being made, but by and large it wasn't being removed either. And towards the end of her reign, there was a new drive towards ceremonialism within the church, towards order, comeliness of worship, and what Bishop Hooker called the beauty of holiness. As we have been doing, Hooker looked back to the Temple of Jerusalem and the Ark of the Covenant, observed the beauty with which they were made, and wanted to do the same. By the early 17th century, this ceremonialism was really gaining traction. Under Charles I and then James I, and under the swelling leadership of Bishop, then Archbishop Laud, new stained glass finally began to be commissioned. This was mostly in the privileged and, relatively speaking, quite private environs of aristocratic houses and in Oxford and Cambridge colleges. Thus, the Van Ling brothers were busy through the 1610s to the 1630s, installing major new glazing programs in college chapels, beginning with Wadham. This was the great era of painted glass, in which enamel paints were applied over clear glass, creating an effect much closer to painting on canvas than to the mosaic of glass that we'd known before. These so-called picture windows came in for criticism in the 19th century, but they were hugely admired in the early 17th, and their sophisticated theological programs followed pre-Reformation patterns of matching events and figures from the Old and the New Testament in pairs, types and antitypes, and they gave context and focus to a new emphasis on the altar and the Eucharist. Unfortunately for the high church proponents of beauty and order in all things liturgical, the Commonwealth crashed in upon their plans, and what the 16th century reformers had left, the Puritans now wanted to destroy. Glass was among the named targets. Once again, practicalities sometimes overcame iconoclasm. The windows at King's College, Cambridge probably survived because there was simply too much glass to deal with, and because the chapel was quite useful as a military training ground. Incidentally, and with presumably unwitting irony, there is a 19th century stained glass window of Cromwell in the United Reformed Church in Cambridge. Cromwell in stained glass. If we can get him. Yes. There he is on the left. Glass was then ruled out until the restoration of the monarchy, and afterwards its position, along with most church decoration and imagery, was frankly quite ambiguous for a while. But slowly, glass returned. In 2 centuries of upheaval around religious images, the theological commentary on glass had been subsumed into the arguments for and against images, and the defense of glass had largely been reduced to a claim that it could teach people biblical stories. Very occasionally, however, one finds an echo of the medieval theology of glass in the poetry of the 16th and 17th centuries, and it's tempting to speculate that some of those metaphors about stained glass windows might have been sufficiently embedded in the cultural consciousness that they survived in poetic forms, and we'll come back to this later. The 18th century actually saw the removal of a lot of stained glass for reasons of fashion rather than theology, and new churches built in this period sometimes had clear glass, which was felt to be easier for reading. But new glass using the enamel painting picture window technique was commissioned, and it was often based on works by celebrated continental artists who were often Roman Catholics. So in fact, there is a surprising amount of Roman Catholic art in Anglican churches in the 18th century. At the same time, glass was being imported from the continent and installed in English churches, including medieval pieces that were now valued as antiquarian. And that antiquarian interest eventually fed into the 19th century Gothic revival, the great revival of the art of glassmaking, and an interest in medieval and medieval-style glass. The High Church Oxford movement had its aesthetic counterpart in the Cambridge Camden Society, later the Ecclesiological Society, which promoted the Gothic style as the only acceptable aesthetic for English churches. Their interests coincided with a rapidly expanding market for stained glass, at a time when around 100 churches were being built or renovated each year. And our church was one of them, with the glass being installed from 1869 onwards. It's quite hard to know exactly which pre-Reformation theologians the ecclesiologists read, but they certainly translated and published William Durandus's treatise on the symbolism of churches. And key figures in Victorian art and architecture, Catholic as well as Anglican, to greater and lesser degrees, recognized the inherent theological potential of glass. Pugin, for instance, knew Abbot Suger's writings about Saint-Denis, and like Suger, Pugin delighted in what he called the sublime effect of stained glass, which transformed ordinary daylight into something more sacred, mysterious, and devotional. The designer Francis Oliphant never quotes his sources, but his treatise on stained glass makes an extended case for it in highly theological terms. And even Ruskin, who got a bit jittery about glittery things, which he thought might lure innocent Englishmen into the jaws of a Roman Catholic trap, thought of churches as being built, metaphorically speaking, of crystal. And he describes the mind of a good architect as like a glass of sweet and strange colour, of sweet and strange clarity, which allows us to see more than we could by ourselves. By and large, however, the Victorians didn't write much theology about glass. They got on with designing it and installing it. And in the process, Victorian windows were put to theological use in two rather new ways. First, they were used to tell a story about the church in England, presented as a continuous history stretching back to Anglo-Saxon times and the Anglo-Saxon saints, and bypassing the problem of the Reformation. In this Victorian rebranding of the Church of England, stained glass helped to reclaim and legitimise saints, whose veneration had, of course, been a major source of Reformed outrage and which had remained quite a touchy subject. And it allowed a kind of visual canonisation of leading figures in the Church of England from the Reformation onwards. And we can see this nowhere more clearly than at Truro Cathedral, where the Clayton and Bell windows present a sequence that runs from Christ in glory in the east window to the early church, the Latin and Greek fathers, and on to British Christianity and leading statesmen, ending up with the Prince of Wales laying the foundation stone of the cathedral in 1880 in one continuous sweep. There he is on the right laying the foundation stone. And our own window of English saints in the north aisle just there shows St Aidan, St Hilda and the Venerable Bede. And in the Lady Chapel we have St Edmund Martyr, St Oswald, St Chad and St Alban. The second theological thing which Victorian windows did in a new way was memorialising the dead. Medieval windows were sometimes gifts from donors who requested that prayers be said for their souls and who might be depicted kneeling in prayer or making an offering. These were necessarily very wealthy people. The newly affordable Victorian glass made memorial windows accessible to the middle classes, or even by subscription to the lower classes. Increasingly, windows became a part of the Victorian culture around death. They immortalised individuals as protagonists on whom the glass bestowed an aura of sanctity, or they offered solemn but comforting depictions of the Good Shepherd, of Jesus blessing the children, or of the saints in glory. And our nave windows are mostly memorial gifts. Although they date well into the 20th century and are more Edwardian than Victorian, they follow the same pattern. While Victorian theologians said little about the transformative nature of glass or its role in expanding the hearts and minds of its viewers, Victorian donors used glass to do something very like that, embedding their hopes and their aspirations for the dearly departed in the fabric of their churches. And this undoubtedly became a new and visual focus for faith in the afterlife. Embodying prayer in glass like this, whether it is the prayerful hope of eternity for the dead, commitment to the worship of that particular church, or gratitude for the service of the organist, is embodying prayer in a medium which is both architectural and transformative. It's setting prayer not in stone, but in the twin qualities of light and colour, in strength and fragility equally. And the prayer, of course, remains after the donor has left, like a lit candle, glowing with intention and inviting the prayer of others. After the First World War, when the country needed physical memorials to the catastrophic absences in its life, these window prayers expanded to become memorials to the glorious dead, who were increasingly being described as martyrs. Oh, I don't want that. So can we go back a bit, Howard? Yes, stop there, thank you. You can see the soldier here helping Christ with the cross. And these ones are by Christopher Wall, who made many such windows. Now, whether their donors thought, like Augustine, that those who rested in peace would rise in radiant, colourful glory in the company of a crystalline Christ, I'm afraid I don't know. But their choice of glass, the medium which above all others comes to life in the presence of light, was very appropriate. Hugh Easton's neo-Baroque style was very popular with the armed forces, and we have our own more traditional memorial window in the Lady Chapel. And here that memorial is very much in the company of the British saints that I mentioned earlier. So despite historic variations in the type and quality of stained glass being produced, despite periods of iconoclasm or sheer neglect, the association of coloured glass and the coloured light it produces with church interiors has held, by and large, in English churches for around 1300 years. As we've seen, the triumph of stained glass as a particularly apt Christian medium is not only because of its beauty and its capacity to tell the stories that are foundational for the faith, but also because glass sits within biblical frames of reference for thinking about preciousness, decoration, colour, and light in the context of places of divine presence, and within theological frames of reference for thinking about the incarnation and resurrection of Christ, the purity of Mary, the nature of Scripture and teaching, and how we receive grace and the gifts of the Spirit. The temple has the window openings, the Ark and the New Jerusalem have the luminous, colourful, transparent jewels, and a church with stained glass is blessed with them all. Like all church windows, our windows here at Holy Trinity can be seen as channels of divine illumination, as openings through which the Holy Spirit can enter our hearts, as scripture, teachers, preachers, as metaphors for the mysterious ways in which God works God's purposes, and as protection from harm. And they invite us to be living windows in a church built of living stones. So I want to end with a poem by George Herbert. There's quite a body of poetry about stained glass, and I'd have loved to say more about that, but Herbert's is probably the best known, and I'm sure that you all know it. It represents a survival of medieval theologies of glass in an early 17th century, post-Reformation, pre-Commonwealth context, and it remains a much-loved, if little understood, example of those ideas. Herbert explores the inadequacy of the preacher to the task of preaching the eternal word, when he, the preacher, is but brittle, crazy glass, and how through grace he is able to be a window in God's temple. In the analogy that he draws between windows and preacher, Herbert sees God's story come to life, shining through light and colour and creating a stronger regard and awe than just speech alone could achieve. So Herbert writes, "Lord, how can man preach thy eternal word? He is but brittle, crazy glass. Yet in thy temple thou dost him afford this glorious and transcendent place, to be a window through thy grace. But when thou dost anneal in glass thy story, making thy life to shine within the holy preachers, then the light and glory more reverend grows, and more doth win, which else shows waterish, bleak and thin. Doctrine and life, colours and light in one when they combine and mingle, bring a strong regard and awe, but speech alone doth vanish like a flaring thing, and in the ear not conscience ring." So we are called, as Herbert has it, to be a window through thy grace, to receive divine light, to be coloured by it, to be expanded by it, inwards and outwards. And I hope very much that when you next look at church windows, you might remember some of these reasons why we have them, and think of them in a new light, or at least a more colourful light. And because we have not yet reached that stage of eschatological perfection in which we won't need a temple anymore and all the jewels will be provided for us, I also have to hope that you will give generously towards preserving the windows of the temple and the jewels of the New Jerusalem here at Holy Trinity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Chloe. That was absolutely wonderful. Would you be happy to take some questions? Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Is that loud enough? Yeah, great. No, I was just thinking about the subject matter, because we all know that, or we've all been told that it's primarily as a teaching aid that we have so many lovely pictures. But there's not that many variety of actual stories that are told through the windows. Loads of annunciations, loads of nativities. I think Stow on the Wold has got St. Peter's tablecloth with the forbidden foods on it. Mm-hmm. Well, do you know of what any sort of really unique stories that are portrayed in stained glass anywhere? What's the rarest?
What's the rarest? I don't know, I'm afraid. I imagine we've lost quite a few that would have been related to the stories of the saints, because those would have been strong targets for iconoclasm. So all the stories of Thomas à Becket, for instance, were specifically targeted. Henry VIII really hated Thomas à Becket, and very few Thomas windows remain. And there are quite obscure hagiographies of saints that sometimes occur in glass on the continent, which I imagine we've probably lost here. But I'm trying to think of something really unusual. Possibly. Oh.
Thomas the Tank Engine in Rodwell.
Thomas the Tank Engine, well, yes. There you are. I mean, sometimes you do get quite particularly local details. They might not count as biblical stories in that way, but you sometimes get very specific local details. I think the other thing I'd want to say about that is that we make a lot of art as a way of teaching people who couldn't read. I do sometimes think that is slightly overstated, because if you don't know the story, it's very hard to learn it from the glass. They're a great way of remembering stories, or of discovering new aspects of a story, but they really can't be treated as just an equivalent of a literate way of learning. And I think we do them a disservice when we just think of them in that sense.
Any more questions?
Yep. After all the destruction of glass in the Reformation, particularly in parliamentary towns, you showed a lovely picture of the east window at Gloucester Cathedral. How do you think that survived?
I'm not sure in the case of Gloucester. I mean, it survived the dissolution of the monasteries by being reassigned as a secular cathedral, and Henry wasn't too worried about that. How it survived later on, I'm afraid I don't know. Mm. It's quite odd sometimes. There are places where you think, surely the glass here must have been lost, or why on earth did the glass here get targeted? And I think sometimes it does come down to the individuals in charge at the time and to practicalities. I mean, those windows in King's College, Cambridge, it used to be thought that they must have been removed and hidden and put back. And now it's turned out that there really is no archaeological evidence for that. They weren't removed, and possibly it was simply impractical. Huge windows are the hardest to deal with, and sometimes they survive almost by default. Occasionally heads get knocked out, but the effort and the risk involved in removing really big expanses of glass is quite significant. So sometimes it's easier to target a little parish church, but I don't know the details on Gloucester.
Thank you for such a good talk, first off. My question is a slightly different angle on it. Highly skilled work to create high-quality, transparent glass to go in all these magnificent early cathedrals and so on. Were there superb centres of glassmaking, and were there trade around different countries even to get blue glass from, I don't know, Germany to come to here, or green glass to go somewhere else? Tell us a little bit about that if you can.
Yes, there were, and glaziers travelled quite a lot. I mean, the earliest glaziers in Britain were brought over by Bishop Biscop from Gaul to come and do their work here, and then to teach people locally how to make glass in that way. And there are stories that a couple of centuries later nobody knew how to make that glass around there, and then it picks up again somewhere else. So yes, there definitely were centres. York was always a centre of glass making, for instance. They were often, the position of glass making works was often to do with where they could get the right kind of materials. So there are certain kinds of wood that you need to make the potash that you use. And I'm not an expert on the production process, but you'll sometimes find glass where the right kind of wood can be found. Part of the reason that there was a fashion for painted glass in the 17th century and into the 18th century was that there was a massive hitch in glass production in the Lorraine region, I think, where there'd been Huguenot glassworks, which were shut down because of a local war. And suddenly there just wasn't enough glass. So what do you do? Well, painting on clear glass then becomes a much more attractive proposition than trying to make the stained glass from scratch, because glass had been imported from there and now it wasn't available. So there is a whole economy and trade sector in that, and sometimes great shortages and other times huge abundance. And a lot of moving around.
But
Yeah.
glass was, that beautiful jeweled coloured glass was made in England.
Sometimes, yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Chloe. I was fascinated by the symbolism that people down the centuries have seen in holes in the wall and glass and coloured glass. And I'm just thinking that the white light falls from outside on the glass, and the red bits of glass are red because the blue has been eliminated. But it's not quite as simple as that, because next to the red piece of glass is a blue piece of glass, and that's blue because the red has been eliminated. So this process of creative beauty comes about by selective destruction of certain bits of light. I don't know if anybody's ever made anything of that from a spiritual aspect.
That's a really interesting point. And the modern understanding, and I don't claim that my physics is up to this, but the modern understanding of how light and colour interact is relatively new. For those medieval theologians, there was a constant debate about whether colour was a thing in its own right or whether it was just a property of light. Where did the colour come from? Was it part of the material that the light was going through, or was it somehow in the light and got activated by something? And there was this sort of movement to and fro whether light was a material thing or an ethereal thing. And whether colour was a material thing or an ethereal thing. And different theological emphases as a result of that. But I'm interested in what you say about the selective process in that something has to withdraw, as it were, to allow something else to come forward. Because also, when you look at glass in changing light, and of course, unless it's in a museum case with a stable light box behind it, the kind of light that we see through windows, the colours change throughout the day, and the impression of the window changes throughout the day. And the interaction between those colours will alter quite considerably. And if you have a huge amount of one colour in one window, other colours alongside it will look different from how they would look in another window if you had a different kind of balance in that. And I think that's something that glass designers have been very aware of, and that viewers have perhaps been less explicitly aware of, even though they will see the effect of it. They've maybe been less conscious of the way in which those effects are achieved.
Do you think, going back to that lady's question about... Going back to your question about storytelling, are we not denying those early makers of cathedrals for the house of God that actually they just wanted to decorate it like they did in the ancient Bible? And you sort of brought that point more home. You can decorate, it's all right.
Yeah. Saying that art is didactic has always been an iconophile, an image-loving excuse for all the other things that art can do. It's the kind of baseline. And as soon as there's an argument that says, oh, we shouldn't have art because it's dangerous, because it does this, it does that, it's distracting, it's immoral, it's expensive, it's whatever, then the people who want the images go back to saying, oh, but it's very good for teaching people. And it's really hard to argue with that. You know, even quite hardline Reformation figures would often allow images that were useful for teaching people. And you could have illustrated Bibles even if you couldn't have stained glass windows. But it's always the baseline. Yes, this will teach people. Actually, most of the interesting stuff happens after that didactic level. And it's what it memorializes, or what it inspires, or what it reveals. And that epiphanic quality of art becomes much more important. But I think with stained glass particularly, if we think about it in terms of the Ark and the Temple and the New Jerusalem, then its sheer decorative delight really comes to the fore, almost more than with anything else. That jeweled quality is just sheer delight in decoration. Yeah.
Thank you. Years ago, I went to Chartres Cathedral, and when one goes into that cathedral, it's so dark. It's incredibly dark. And gradually, as my eyes got accustomed to the dark, I saw one window which had some certain relevance to me. It's a picture of a coffin in red. The next window was the same coffin in green. I thought, oh, there's something about the colours here. But the irony of it is, my name's Green, and my mother's name is Hope. I understand that green is significant to hope.
Yeah, colour symbolism is really hard to pin down because it changes between times, places, and cultures. So it's very difficult to pin down. But a kind of baseline association between green and life and things that grow, and therefore with hope, is a very standard one, yes. You've got to be really careful about saying, well, this colour means X. There are some sort of broad generalizations one can make, but in a specific instance, you really need to have some other evidence to bear on that. But in general, I would say, yeah, green is life. Had you been worrying about that, Father Jeff?
Thank you, Chloe. First of all, an observation. There is a Burne-Jones window in Painswick, which is generally not available to be seen. It's in a redundant church halfway up Gloucester Street. Mm-hmm. It's a magnificent window. I think it's, from memory, the Angel Gabriel. But if you find that building open at any time, do go and have a look, because it's a fantastic window.
Group outing, anyone?
It's used as a storeroom by a chap who collects antique chairs, basically, and every now and again he decides to sell something and he'll open the building up and you can get it.
He has an angel to look after his chairs.
Anyway, honestly, it's worth making a trip to just have a look at it. It's huge, actually. It's one window with the Angel Gabriel.
Wow.
The second is a question. Medieval churches, and I think to some extent modern ones too, use walls for wall paintings, decoration like that. And is there any relationship between the imagery on a wall painting and the imagery in the glass? Thinking historically, most of the churches I've been in with wall paintings seem to have clear glass rather than coloured glass. And I wonder if that's deliberate, so that the wall paintings are more visible, because the colour of coming through a stained glass window is clearly going to distort the imagery. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that was a great debate among the 19th century ecclesiologists, was whether it was okay to have stained glass windows and wall paintings. And by and large, they went for the approach that the more surfaces you could cover in something decorative and illustrative, the better. And that having paintings and glass together would allow them to work cooperatively, but that putting clear glass against painted walls or stained glass against unpainted walls was somehow harsh and abrupt and difficult, and they really quite liked the idea of a sort of seamless covering of surfaces. And if you go to a Pugin church, for instance, you will very much get that seamless covering of surfaces. St Giles Cheadle hasn't, I think, got a single surface that isn't decorated with something in it. I mean, it's quite overwhelming. Medieval churches would mostly have had both. If they could afford stained glass, they'd have had wall paintings and stained glass. So those things would have worked cooperatively. But of course, the stained glass often gets lost, and you might be left with a replaced clear glazing and some kind of wall decoration left. I think there's a big issue of taste in that, but there are very, very early examples in, I think, don't quote me on this, but I think 3rd, 4th century Christian buildings that would have St. Peter and St. Paul often on either side of a clear window. There's not necessarily any glass in the window at all, as if they were aware of the presence of the light. And there's a suggestion among historians of early church decoration that possibly windows, because they were seen as this source of divine light and of light that was transformed by going through that hole in the wall, were sort of special sites of devotion, and that you could put the saints on either side of them so that they were looking towards the light and directing you in that way. So I think there are different ways of looking at that.
Any more questions?
Chloe, I find myself as a trained artist and somebody with a stronger visual sense than verbal, inevitably Anglo-Catholic. And I look across the divide in the church and wonder why it is that Protestantism, with all its enormous values, has been so opposed to image.
And your question, why are Protestants opposed to image? Well, we can take a historical line on that and say, that the Reformers were reacting against things that they thought were excessive or superstitious or magical or mistaken. But I think a fear of the material has been a characteristic of some Christians from as long as there have been Christians, and an anxiety about how the spiritual might relate to the material has almost always been present in some form, and erupts more powerfully at certain times. The difficulty of holding in tension a fallen creation and human sinfulness with the goodness of God's creation and people being made in the image of God is sometimes just too hard to hold on to, I think. That either that's a tension that you can live with every single day and cope with that ambiguity and perhaps even enjoy it, or it becomes overwhelming and frightening and a source of uncertainty and doubt, and you need to pin your colours to one particular mast, and then that mast tends to be the Word, the Bible, sola scriptura. And I think in some ways the Anglican Church has done quite a good via media, as it very often does, and has made room for both. But I personally would suggest that it is that difficulty of living with ambiguity that pushes think maybe everybody is thirsty now.
Well, what a wonderful evening we've had. Not only the fantastic talk from Chloe, which really does set the light to our project here to restore, as far as possible, many of our own windows, but also the questions from you, which have been stimulating and challenging as well. I can't do anything at all more than that, but I'd just like to draw one or two things out, if I may. And I mean, first of all, the question of light, and I think that one of the things that we've achieved through our reordering of this church is a real enhancement of the light quality of the church. And the state of the windows doesn't necessarily reflect that. And I feel very strongly that actually in tackling the restoration of the windows, we will be contributing enormously to that enhancement of light. There's a terrific amount of symbolism in our windows. We've heard a lot about the symbolism of stained glass windows and the richness and diversity of stories that can be told through the stained glass. I'm very impressed. I'm always impressed here by the richness of this church. I mean, we have stained glass in almost all our windows, which is a wonderful asset for us. I mean, this is like coming into a great gallery of fantastic art, all of which has deep meaning, imbued with deep meaning. And we have a real responsibility towards the proper protection and curation of the art in this gallery. So many things, so many threads, so many details that we can think about. I love the concluding words of George Herbert, and I'm sure we can think of a lot more poetry that we could use to enhance our own philosophy of what we're doing here too. Enough of that, but I just want to say really an enormous thank you to Chloe for a really wonderful evening, a stimulating, challenging evening, and one that has we will be thinking about for a long time, and really sets the framework for the work that we're doing in the restoration of our own stained glass. So, Chloe, thank you very, very much indeed for a wonderful, wonderful evening. Judith's got something. Go and enjoy a drink, I think.